In the end, the senseless raid by the South Vietnamese Army, fully backed by U.S. air support, only served to highlight the incredible tenacity of the North Vietnamese Army forces. Operation Lam Son 719 in 1971. North Vietnamese soldiers were among the most resilient and driven fighters of the 20th century. They were tough, courageous troops. Their attacks were meticulously planned and carried out, but they seemed to fall apart if something went wrong. Everybody fears their enemy, but the NVA were especially feared. They could pass through nearly any defense line and run through an area at night throwing hand grenades and shooting the place up, then be gone. I do not know that is the fact or not. But I do know one thing should stay away from them, period. It was good to excellent. Even after enduring 3 waves of B-52 bombings in a single night, they survived and returned fire on their enemies by morning. In Operation Lam Son 719, the B-52 didn't fight like a conventional aircraft, but operated as a colossal flying fortress, a tool of aerial destruction. It was a lifeline for the South Vietnamese Army in many situations. Yet its terrifying power couldn't compensate for the tactical and morale shortcomings of the ground forces, ultimately failing to change the operation's doomed outcome. But during its years in Vietnam, was the B-52 always powerless against the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters, or were there moments when it brought them to their knees? This is the story of the B-52 in Vietnam. The narrative of Lam Son 719 is one of desperation and dependence. But it was just one chapter in the B-52's long and bloody history in Southeast Asia. To understand the hammer that fell on Laos in 1971, we must first understand the nature of its power, a power honed years earlier under the codename Operation Arc Light. It was a campaign that turned a Cold War nuclear sentinel into a conventional juggernaut, forever changing the face of aerial warfare. The B-52's ability to unleash a devastating cascade of bombs from high altitude, arriving unheard and unseen until the moment of impact, created a weapon of immense psychological terror. This capability would be put to the ultimate test in the dense jungles and fortified mountains of Vietnam. Before the first ARVN M41 tank even rolled across the Laotian border, the B-52s were already at work. Their mission was to pave the way. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was not a single dirt road. It was a complex, braided network of track storage depots, command posts, and bivouac areas, all expertly concealed beneath the dense jungle canopy. This logistical artery was the lifeblood of the North Vietnamese war effort, a hydra-headed serpent that when one path was cut, would simply grow 2 more. Interdicting it was the key to strangling the insurgency in the south. U.S. intelligence, using a combination of aerial reconnaissance and electronic intercepts, had identified key NVA concentrations and logistical hubs along the planned axis of Advance Route 9. These targets were not just points on a map. They were heavily fortified bastions dug deep into the earth and protected by the natural armor of the jungle itself. For days, arc light missions ran around the clock. The B-52s systematically pounded these suspected locations. Their objectives were threefold: destroy defenses, to obliterate NVA bunkers, trench systems, and forward-deployed units that could ambush the ARVN advance, disrupt command and control, to shatter enemy communication lines and create chaos among the NVA leadership, buying the ARVN critical time in the opening hours. Prepare the landing zones, to carve clearings out of the jungle. The fire support bases critical for the operation's success were to be established on remote hilltops. B-52s would cleanse these hilltops, stripping them of vegetation and any hidden defenders, making the subsequent helicopter assaults far less perilous. In this initial phase, the B-52s were the invisible architects of the battlefield, reshaping the very terrain to favor the ARVN's advance. The path forward was paved with craters. The initial advance, aided by the arc light prep, went relatively well. But the NVA were masters of their terrain. They weathered the initial storm and launched a ferocious counteroffensive. Their strategy was brilliant and brutal. Bypass the main ARVN columns on Route 9 and instead focus on besieging and annihilating the isolated fire support bases. This is where the B-52's role shifted from a preparatory tool to an emergency lifeline. At fire bases like FSB-31, FSB-30, and the infamous Firebase Lolo ARVN units found themselves surrounded by NVA forces that vastly outnumbered them. Pounded day and night by 130mm artillery and facing massed infantry and tank assaults, their situations became dire. The dense NVA anti-aircraft fire made low-level tactical air support from fighter jets and helicopter gunships an impossible proposition. The thick jungle and close-quarters fighting often neutralized the effectiveness of fast-moving jets. In these desperate moments, the only weapon that could break the sieges was the B-52. The call would go out from an American advisor with the ARVN, or a forward air controller flying high overhead. Arc light needed. Coordinates follow. Danger close. Danger close is one of the most terrifying phrases in warfare. It means calling in an artillery or airstrike on a location perilously close to your position. For a B-52 strike, the minimum safe distance was supposed to be at least 1 kilometer, preferably 3. But at places like Firebase 31, the NVA had hugged the RVN perimeter, pressing so close that any airstrike was a gamble. The B-52 crews, guided by ground-based combat skyspot radar systems, would fly their missions with terrifying precision. For the ARVN defenders huddled in their foxholes, it was an act of faith. This precision was not magic. It was the product of a sophisticated system that allowed controllers on the ground, sometimes hundreds of miles away, to guide the high-flying bombers to a precise release point. Using radar beacons and complex calculations, these controllers could place a 1-mile-long carpet of bombs with remarkable accuracy, turning a weapon of mass destruction into a surprisingly nimble tool of tactical support. They would hear the incoming whistling death, knowing that a few hundred meters away, an entire NVA battalion preparing to assault their lines was about to be vaporized. The sheer concussion wave from the chain of explosions could kill without leaving a mark, rupturing the internal organs of soldiers in deep bunkers. Survivors often emerged dazed, shell-shocked, and utterly demoralized. The ground would shake so violently, it felt like the hill itself was collapsing. But when the dust settled, the NVA assault would be broken, their formations shattered, leaving a landscape of scorched earth and stunned silence. Time and again, these danger close strikes were the only thing that prevented the fire bases from being completely overrun. The B-52 became the ultimate symbol of American commitment, a hammer swung from the heavens when all other options had failed. It was a terrifying high-stakes relationship of dependence, demonstrating both the awesome power of U.S. air power and the critical vulnerability of the RVN on the ground. Despite the B-52's intervention, the NVA's pressure was relentless. One by one, the fire bases fell. The ARVN advance stalled short of its main objective, the town of Chapone. After a face-saving helicopter assault to briefly occupy the now empty town, the order was given to retreat. What followed was not a strategic withdrawal, but a chaotic, desperate flight for the border. The NVA pursued with a vengeance, setting up ambushes along Route 9, turning the road into a miles-long shooting gallery. The ARVN columns disintegrated their command structure, collapsing under the pressure. Once again, the B-52s were called in this time to act as a shield. As the battered ARVN remnants streamed back toward Vietnam, B-52s flew continuous missions, creating a wall of fire behind them. They didn't target specific units so much as they targeted the geography itself. This was interdiction on a grand scale. The bombers aimed to make the jungle itself impassable. They bombed the roads, the valleys, and the jungle on either side of the retreat route, creating impassable zones of destruction. The goal was to disrupt the NVA's pursuit, to sow chaos in their ranks, and to block their path with a curtain of explosions. Many surviving ARVN soldiers would later credit these B-52 strikes for their survival, believing that without that fiery shield, the NVA would have caught and annihilated them. Operation Lam Son 719 was by most strategic measures a failure for the US and South Vietnam. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was not severed. The ARVN's elite units were mauled, suffering catastrophic losses in men and materiel. The operation starkly revealed that without American advisors and ground troops, the RVN could not stand up to the NVA in a major conventional battle, even with total air supremacy. The Vietnamization policy had been dealt a devastating blow. But within that strategic failure, the performance of the B-52 was a tactical masterpiece of raw power. It had performed every task asked of it with brutal efficiency. It inflicted staggering casualties on the NVA, broke up countless assaults, and saved thousands of ARVN lives. Its psychological impact was immeasurable, yet it also highlighted its own limits. A B-52 could not hold ground. It could not stop the NVA from simply rebuilding the trail or finding new routes. Its destructive power was awesome, but indiscriminate, unable to counter the NVA's tactic of hugging the enemy. Most importantly, the ARVN's utter dependence on the B-52's power underscored the fundamental weakness the operation was meant to disprove. In the end, the B-52 was the perfect tool for a flawed strategy. It was a god of war that could win every battle it was called to, but it could not win the war. However, its story was far from over. The lessons learned in the skies over Laos would be applied with even greater intensity just 1 year later, in the defining moment of the B-52's long combat career. To truly appreciate the B-52, one must travel back to a different era, a time of global anxiety and nuclear brinkmanship. The B-52 was not born for the jungles of Southeast Asia. It was conceived as the ultimate instrument of the days of extreme Cold War tension. Its development was heavily influenced by the strategic bombing theories of visionaries like Lieutenant Colonel Billy Mitchell, who argued that wars could be won by attacking an enemy's industrial capacity and will to fight not just its armies on the front lines. After the decisive bombing campaigns of World War II, this doctrine became central to U.S. military thought. In November 1945, with the embers of World War II still cooling, Air Materiel Command issued a challenging set of performance requirements for a new strategic bomber. The core demand was for an aircraft that could execute its mission without relying on forward bases in Europe or the Pacific, which might not be available in a future conflict. In the late 1940s, as the Iron Curtain descended across Europe, the United States Air Force issued a requirement for a new long-range strategic bomber. The mission was simple and terrifying: to fly deep into the heart of the Soviet Union and deliver a nuclear payload. The aircraft had to be fast, fly high, and carry an unprecedented weapon load across intercontinental distances. The initial proposals were for massive straight-winged aircraft powered by turboprop engines. But in October 1948, a team of Boeing engineers holed up in a hotel room in Dayton, Ohio. Over a single weekend threw out the old designs. Inspired by new jet engine technology, they sketched out a revolutionary concept on balsa wood models and engineering paper, a massive 8-engine bomber with sharply swept-back wings. This weekend wonder was the blueprint for what would become the B-52 Stratofortress. When the prototype YB-52 first flew in 1952, it was a breathtaking sight. Its 185-foot wingspan was so vast and flexible that it required small outrigger wheels at the wingtips to keep them from scraping the ground during takeoff. The wings themselves, thin and swept at 35 degrees, were an engineering triumph, providing both high-speed performance and the lift needed to carry a heavy payload to extreme altitudes. Its 8 Pratt & Whitney J57 turbojet engines slung in pods of 2 beneath the wings gave it the power to reach speeds over 600 miles per hour and a ceiling above 50,000 feet. It was an engineering marvel, a titan built for a singular chilling purpose. The first B-52A model took to the skies in 1954. and the operational B model entered service with Strategic Air Command in 1955, officially replacing the lumbering Convair B-36 Peacemaker. Boeing would go on to build 744 B-52s in total, with the final and most enduring H model being delivered in October 1962. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the B-52 became the cornerstone of America's nuclear deterrent under the iron fist of General Curtis LeMay and the Strategic Air Command. SAC's motto was, "Peace is our profession," a grim euphemism for the reality of mutually assured destruction. The B-52 was the delivery man for that destruction. This was the era of the Chrome Dome missions. Around the clock, 24/7, a fleet of B-52s was kept on airborne alert flying routes that took them to the edges of Soviet airspace. This constant presence ensured that a significant portion of America's nuclear arsenal was airborne and safe from a surprise Soviet first strike, ready to retaliate at a moment's notice. Each bomber carried nuclear weapons, and its crew was trained to execute a strike order without hesitation. For these young men, the weight of the world was literally on their shoulders. They lived in a state of constant high-stakes readiness, knowing that a single coded message could be the signal to begin World War III. On the ground, hundreds more B-52s were kept on 15-minute alert, their crews living in special facilities near the flight line, ready to scramble and be airborne before enemy missiles could reach their bases. The B-52 was more than an aircraft. It was a political statement. Its presence in the skies was a constant reminder to the Kremlin of America's global reach and devastating power. The aircraft was continuously updated with new electronics countermeasures and the ability to launch standoff nuclear missiles like the Hound Dog, allowing it to strike from outside the densest Soviet air defenses. It was the long, sharp spear of American foreign policy. While the B-52 stood its nuclear vigil, a different kind of war was brewing in Southeast Asia. Initially, it seemed unthinkable to use a multi-million-dollar strategic bomber designed for nuclear war in a low-intensity counterinsurgency conflict. But as the Vietnam War escalated, the Pentagon sought a way to bring overwhelming firepower to bear. General William Westmoreland, commander of U.S. forces in South Vietnam, became a key advocate, convinced that the B-52's unique capabilities could be decisive against an elusive enemy hiding in dense jungle terrain. The answer was the Big Belly program. Engineers modified the B-52D models, rewiring and reconfiguring their massive bomb bays to dramatically increase their conventional payload. These modifications, beginning in December 1965, were a game changer. A Big Belly B-52 could carry a staggering 84 Mark 82 500-pound bombs internally, with another 24 750-pound bombs mounted on its wing pylons. The total payload exceeded 60,000 pounds. This was 22,000 pounds more than the unmodified F models they replaced. And by April 1966, the entire B-52F fleet in the theater had been replaced by the far more capable B-52Ds. This transformed the B-52 from a nuclear scalpel into a conventional sledgehammer. In June 1965, the first Arc-Light mission was flown, and the BUF, an unofficial acronym, Big Ugly Fat Fucker, had entered a new kind of war. The first mission on June 18, 1965, was a baptism by fire. 30 B-52Fs took off from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam to strike a Viet Cong stronghold near Ben Cat. However, the mission was marred by tragedy before it even began. In the darkness, high above the churning winds of Super Typhoon Dinah, two of the bombers collided during a refueling maneuver. Both aircraft were lost, and 8 of the 12 crewmen perished. Of the 4 who ejected their survival by parachuting into a Category 5 typhoon is a story of almost unbelievable endurance. Despite the catastrophic start, the remaining bombers pressed on, delivering their payload and marking the B-52's combat debut. From that difficult beginning, Arc-Light operations grew exponentially. To support the increased tempo, bombers operated from Andersen AFB in Guam and the newly established Utapao Royal Thai Navy Airfield in Thailand, which significantly reduced flight times and the need for aerial refueling. By mid-1966, B-52s were dropping around 8,000 tons of bombs every month. This relentless pressure had a profound psychological effect. As General Westmoreland noted from prisoner interrogations, enemy troops fear B-52's tactical air artillery and armor in that order. The reason was simple: flying at over 30,000 feet, the bombers were ghosts, their presence only known when the world exploded. This destructive power proved decisive in two of the war's most iconic sieges. At Khe Sanh in 1968, during the 77-day ordeal, Operation Niagara saw B-52s drop nearly 60,000 tons of bombs on the NVA forces encircling the Marine base. Using an innovative grid system called Bugle Note, controllers could bring in cells of 6 B-52s every 3 hours to systematically obliterate enemy positions. Westmoreland himself later told B-52 crews that their fire was what broke their back. Similarly, at An Loc in 1972, when a massive NVA assault threatened to overrun the town, the Air Force flew B-52 missions every 55 minutes for 30 consecutive hours, unleashing 170 bombers that devastated entire enemy regiments. If Lam Son 719 showed the B-52 as a savior, Operation Linebacker II showed it as a punisher. By late 1972, peace talks in Paris had stalled. A frustrated President Nixon, enraged by what he saw as North Vietnamese intransigence, became determined to force a resolution. He had won re-election on a promise of peace with honor. And with his second term approaching, he ordered the Pentagon to draw up plans for a massive, unrestricted bombing campaign. The objective was simple: to inflict so much pain on North Vietnam's heartland that they would have no choice but to return to the negotiating table and sign the treaty. On December 18, 1972, the order was given. The targets were the political and industrial heart of North Vietnam, Hanoi, and the port city of Haiphong. This was a mission unlike any Arclight sortie. The gloves were off, and the bombers would be striking at the core of the enemy's war-making capacity. Power plants, rail yards, command centers, and airfields. This was the mission the B-52 was built for. But against an enemy it had never faced the most sophisticated and heavily defended air defense network on Earth. The skies over Hanoi were protected by a dense ring of Soviet-supplied SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missiles, MiG-21 interceptors, and thousands of radar-guided anti-aircraft guns. The North Vietnamese had 36 SAM battalions ringing the city, and they had spent years studying the B-52's tactics. They were ready. On the night of December 18, 1972, the first wave of over 100 B-52s roared into the night. What followed was 11 days of the most intense air combat of the war. The NVA air defenders fought back with everything they had. The sky was filled with the fiery trails of SAMs, a deadly lattice of missiles climbing towards the bomber streams. On that first night alone, they launched over 200 SA-2s. The B-52 crews flew into this maelstrom night after night. Their aircraft were equipped with a suite of electronic countermeasures to jam enemy radar, and they flew in carefully planned cells designed to mutually support each other's defensive systems. But the sheer volume of SAMs was overwhelming. The initial tactics, which involved repetitive flight paths and a steep post-target turn, proved disastrously predictable. This turn, a relic of nuclear strike procedures designed to escape a bomb's blast, was a fatal flaw. It caused the bombers to present a larger radar profile, degraded their ECM coverage, and slowed their ground speed as they turned into the wind. The NVA missile crews quickly identified this murder point and waited. The losses mounted at an alarming rate. December 20th became the darkest day, and 6 B-52s were shot down in a single night. The loss rate was so catastrophic that SASE headquarters took the unprecedented step of recalling the second wave of bombers mid-mission. In total, 15 B-52s were shot down during Linebacker II, with 33 airmen killed. The crews knew the risks. They were flying the same predictable routes night after night in the initial phase, a controversial tactic that made them vulnerable but was deemed necessary for coordination. They were true heroes, flying into the teeth of the world's deadliest air defenses to execute their mission. Amidst the chaos, there were moments of incredible bravery. Staff Sergeant Samuel Turner and Airman First Class Albert Moore, both tail gunners, Each shot down a MiG-21 that was attempting to intercept their bombers, rare victories for the defensive armament of the Stratofortress. The shock of the losses forced an immediate and radical tactical rethink. Complaints from frontline commanders finally broke through the chain of command. The rigid, predictable flight paths were abandoned. New plans sent bombers in from multiple directions at varying altitudes, compressing the entire attack wave into a 20-minute window to overwhelm enemy radars. The steep post-target turn was eliminated. Crucially, the more vulnerable B-52G models, which had less effective ECM suites against the older SA-2s, were restricted from flying over the most heavily defended areas. These changes worked instantly. On December 26th, the Air Force launched a massive 120-bomber raid that saturated North Vietnamese defenses. Losses dropped dramatically, but the B-52s and the tactical aircraft supporting them inflicted devastating damage. They crippled North Vietnam's infrastructure, destroyed military facilities, and exhausted its supply of SAMs. The psychological and physical pressure was immense. On December 29th, Hanoi signaled its readiness to return to the negotiating table. Weeks later, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. Debate continues to this day about the effectiveness and morality of Linebacker II. But for the U.S. Air Force, it was a clear-cut demonstration of strategic air power. They believed the B-52 had in 11 days achieved a political objective that years of grinding ground warfare could not. One might assume that an aircraft designed in the 1940s would have been retired long ago. But the B-52 has defied all expectations, outlasting not only its contemporaries, but also many of the aircraft designed to replace it. The Buff's story didn't end with Vietnam. In the 1991 Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm B-52s flew from bases as far away as Louisiana on marathon 35-hour missions to launch the opening shots of the air campaign, firing conventional air-launched cruise missiles that crippled Iraqi command and control. In the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the B-52 underwent another evolution. It transformed from a carpet bomber into a remarkably precise close air support platform, outfitted with advanced targeting pods like the Lightning. A B-52 could loiter for hours high above the battlefield, acting as an airborne command post and delivering GPS-guided joint direct attack munitions with pinpoint accuracy to support troops on the ground. A single B-52 could carry more precision bombs than an entire squadron of fighter jets, making it an incredibly efficient and feared weapon in the global war on terror. So why does this ageless warrior endure? That's because robust airframe. The B-52 was simply built to last. Its airframe is one of the most durable ever designed, capable of withstanding enormous stress. Adaptability. Its massive size and payload capacity have made it an incredibly versatile platform, able to incorporate new weapon sensors and electronics with relative ease. It can carry an astonishing array of weapons, from conventional gravity bombs and cluster munitions to sophisticated air-launched cruise missiles and precision-guided weapons, with a total payload exceeding 70,000 pounds. Cost-effectiveness. It is far cheaper to operate per flight hour than its stealthy younger cousins, the B-1 and B-2, making it the workhorse of the bomber fleet for a wide range of missions. Today, the Air Force plans to keep the B-52 flying until at least the 2050s, which would mark an unprecedented 100-year service life for a military aircraft. It is currently undergoing its most significant upgrade, yet receiving new fuel-efficient Rolls-Royce F-30 engines, which will earn it the new designation B-52J, a new ASA radar, and a completely modernized cockpit. The B-52 has become a part of American culture. It's the buff to its crews, a star of films like Dr. Strangelove and a living piece of history. From the nuclear precipice of the Cold War to the sweltering jungles of Southeast Asia, from the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan, the B-52 Stratofortress has been a constant looming presence. It is a machine that has evolved from an instrument of potential global annihilation to a guardian angel for troops in contact. Its shadow, first cast in defiance of a Soviet threat, stretched long over the embattled fire bases of Laos in 1971, where it served as both a savior and a symbol of a flawed strategy. It proved its mettle in the missile-filled skies over Hanoi and has adapted to every new challenge thrown its way for over 7 decades. The B-52 is more than just an assembly of metal wires and engines. It is a testament to the ingenuity of its designers, a tribute to the courage of the crews who flew it into harm's way, and the most enduring symbol of American air power. It is the grandfather of the fleet, the unseen god of war, and an American icon whose thundering roar will continue to echo across the skies for generations to come. Do you like the B-52? It is a great plane and is still used by the U.S. Air Force to this day. Also, if you have any stories about the B-52 and other wars, please share them in the comments. By the way, if there are any other planes you would like to hear about, or if you know of any interesting planes, please let us know. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.